PTSD and avoidance. How are these two things linked together? Well, the simple answer is that it's complicated and we don't really know 100% how these two things interact with each other. But what we do know is that avoidance is a criterion to be diagnosed with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. It's actually criterion C listed in the DSM, which basically means the book that therapists use to diagnose you, which insurance companies need to let them know actually that you're actually being treated for something and that there's a path forward to treatment. That's what it's there for. It's there to let you know that you need to have some kind of avoidance to have post-traumatic stress disorder. Specifically, what it says in Criterion C, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but you either have to be avoiding thoughts, feelings, and body sensations and stuff, or you have to be avoiding people, situations, activities, all kinds of reminders of triggers and stuff. So simply put, and I haven't really actually thought about this way before, but if you're not avoiding things, then you don't really have PTSD. At least not in the way that you would be diagnosed with PTSD. So we know that avoidance and PTSD are linked, but I tried to look up some studies before I sat down to do this, and there wasn't a lot of studies. There's just not a lot of information on this, which kind of bothered me actually that there's not, but I kind of understand why, because research is expensive and maybe this isn't something that they felt they needed to look into. All the different researchers, they have their own agendas and their own reasons why they do research. But we don't have that much information on why avoidance is a part of PTSD. We just kind of generally accept that that's the case. And, just intuitively, it kind of makes sense that if you've gone through something traumatic, then you're going to want to avoid the things that remind you of that traumatic event. Because trauma is life-threatening and scary and terrifying. And of course, you're not going to want to put yourself back into a situation that is similar to what you went through. So one study that I did find that I thought was pretty interesting said that if you dissociate during the traumatic event, during the thing that caused your PTSD, then you're more likely to have avoidance symptoms later on during the PTSD. Kind of interesting to me. So dissociation, for those that don't know, is kind of that feeling of not being connected with your body, not being connected with your environment, maybe like blanking out or just not being able to focus so well. For me personally, like my vision will kind of go hazy and like I won't look cross-eyed, but my vision will go cross-eyed and I'll just kind of like have a hard time remembering things. So if you experience dissociation during the traumatic event, which is a totally normal response to a life-threatening event for your body to kind of like shut down and not want to be fully present for that, then you're more likely to avoid things later, apparently. Now, of course, this was only one study, and we don't know why that is, but to me it kind of makes sense because dissociation is a pretty effective coping mechanism. It's, the body's way of protecting you, and I think it's easy to avoid things when you just kind of blank out and dissociate, because that totally removes you from them. There was also another study that I found that I thought was pretty interesting. It was a neurological study, and I'm always about like the neurology and the brain science and everything. And they looked at people who have PTSD, and they noticed that the people who are more avoidant, they are people who have these areas of the brain that get activated during fear conditioning. And fear conditioning, you could basically think of like what happens when you go through something traumatic and you have now a trigger. So there's something specific that makes you feel frightened and afraid and feel like your life is threatened, even though that's already passed. It doesn't matter that it's past. That's what PTSD is. It's having these triggers inside that bring all those emotions and scary feelings forward. So these areas of the brain that would happen during normal fear conditioning, just, you can get afraid of things without having PTSD. When those areas light up, when they light up strongly, as they do in PTSD, that seems to be an indicator of more avoidance later on, which to me just totally makes sense. And that just highlights that PTSD is a rational thing. Like, it makes sense that people have PTSD. What's confusing, I think, for a lot of people is that some people get PTSD from traumatic experiences and some people don't. That's usually because the people who don't had some kind of coping mechanism, or they just have a better internal understanding of their body and how to cope with these things. But regardless, it's the fear system that's activating, and it's the fear system, you could think of it as fight or flight. It's that flight part of fight or flight that's really making you want to avoid things. So I'm going to link to both of these studies down below if you want to check them out yourself. They are not like conclusive evidence of anything, but they just kind of point us in some directions that I think we should pay attention to. So people on my channel know that I talk about avoidant attachment a lot. It's an attachment style, and usually attachment that's insecure, such as avoidant attachment, it forms in childhood through some kind of a traumatic experience with a parent. Usually it's a traumatic experience. And I'm just kind of like talking free willy-nilly here because there's not really studies, which really surprised me, and I would hope that eventually we get some studies on this, because I would like to see that there is some kind of a correlation or causation here between avoidance and avoidant attachment and PTSD. Like, what is the relationship? Don't you think we should know that? So for me personally, I just believe that it makes sense that somebody who would have PTSD might also have an avoidant attachment. Specifically, I think people with PTSD probably would have an insecure attachment, in particular if their trauma involved another person or somebody who was meant to take care of them at a time when they couldn't take care of themselves. I mean, if you just think about it, if the source of your trauma is another person, which often it is, you know, unless it's like a natural disaster or an event, then it's probably another person that got involved. And when it's another person, it just makes sense that you're going to have a hard time trusting other people in general, and that's going to fold over into your relationships where you have to get the most intimate with somebody. So trauma may be one explanation, maybe the most important one, at least in my opinion, for why people go on to have an avoidant attachment and why people in these relationships either become dismissive avoidant or fearful avoidant, because intimacy is very uncomfortable when other people have hurt you in a life-threatening way previously. Something else that I do want to touch on, because it kind of falls in this realm of avoidance, is avoidant personality disorder. Now, avoidant personality disorder is different from avoidant attachment, and avoidant personality disorder is this fear of criticism from other people, and that fear of being criticized, that fear that we're not adequate enough, that we are not good enough to be around other people, that makes other people kind of scary. And so that's why it's called avoidant personality disorder, because you may decide to avoid other people just to kind of get around that whole issue. Now, again, this is my personal opinion. We don't have enough research to really have conclusive evidence of anything, but I believe that trauma is a source for most personality disorders, including avoidant personality disorder. It just kind of makes sense to me that things get a little out of whack and we have a hard time coping with life when our life has been threatened in a way that we weren't able to cope. Now, I'm certainly not saying that trauma is the only cause for personality disorders. I'm sure there are many other factors than just trauma, but I think it's an important one to consider. And I think when it comes to avoidant personality disorder, again, it makes sense. Why would you feel inadequate around other people? Why would you feel like other people are constantly criticizing you? Maybe there was somebody who did this at a time when you weren't able to cope with it. Maybe it was life-threatening because you didn't have the resources to be able to care for yourself, as infants and children often don't. Okay, so here's the tricky thing when it comes to PTSD and avoidance. Avoidance may help us to manage some of the PTSD. It may help us to not be so triggered and not overwhelmed and not, you know, it might help us to function a little bit better in life, where if we didn't avoid things, it might be harder. But avoidance also seems to prevent us from healing from PTSD, and that really sucks, because when something is life-threatening, it makes sense that we want to avoid it, but you sometimes kind of have to face those things. Unfortunately, and I say this from personal experience because I had to do this myself, you have to move towards those things in order to tackle them, in order to fight back, in order to get yourself back to a place where you can handle those things. And this is true of most of the therapies that are recommended for treating PTSD. The only one that I can think of as an exception is maybe EMDR, where they kind of try to go at it at a roundabout way, but most therapies involve some sort of exposure to the triggers of the traumatic event. It doesn't mean you have to go back in and re-experience the thing that actually traumatized you, but you do, maybe in a safe environment. That's what the therapies are for, to do it systematically, carefully, with a trained therapist, hopefully a trauma specialist, to go and approach these things in a careful, controlled, safe environment so that you don't get so overwhelmed, so that a therapist can watch you and make sure you're not pushing too hard, not pushing too far, and you can walk through it and approach it slowly. So instead of doing avoidance coping, which is kind of what PTSD entails, you do approach coping, which is much more healthy and eventually will help you get you to the other side of PTSD. Now, I just want to say avoidance makes total sense when it comes to PTSD, right? Your life was threatened. It makes sense to want to avoid something like that. Part of fight or flight, the flight part makes sense. It makes sense to run away from something that's going to hurt you. It makes sense to be uncomfortable around something that's going to hurt you. It's normal. It's natural. It's your body's way of trying to protect you. But it becomes a problem when it makes it hard to function in life, when it hurts you in your relationships, when it makes it hard to relate to other people, when you avoid certain things like jobs or situations or whatever because you have PTSD and avoidance standing in the way. So even though avoidance makes sense, and even though avoidance, in my opinion, is totally natural and normal, it still can keep us stuck in PTSD, and ultimately we have to deal with it if we want to move on and have a more fulfilling and happy life. So if you have PTSD, or maybe you know somebody with PTSD, I want to know if this sounds like it rings true to your experience. Do you find that you have to avoid things? Do you know people who, stay away from things because they have PTSD? Do you think that there is a strong link between them? I'm kind of annoyed that there's not enough research, but I understand why there isn't. Would you like to see more research on this topic? Let me know down below in the comments. Let's have a discussion.